All right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're exploring the psychology of the Robotaries today.
Cool.
Yeah, we've got this table, right? It outlines all these psychological pathologies specific to that world.
It's really interesting because it's not just like a list of disorders. It actually connects each one back to the kind of societal pressures in the Robotaries world and the impact of their advanced technology. So it really makes you think, about how those factors could shape mental well-being.
Yeah, it's like
or better.
Cautionary tale almost.
Right.
So where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, the source really dives right into this oppressive system called the Rectitude.
Okay.
And I think looking at a few specific pathologies together, we can see how this regime basically creates an atmosphere of fear and control that has some pretty intense psychological effects.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those.
Sure.
So the table mentions paranoia. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it highlights how this constant surveillance that happens under the Rectitude leads to widespread paranoia among the citizens.
Oh, wow.
It's unsettling because it really mirrors our own growing anxieties about things like, data privacy.
Right.
And just the erosion of privacy in our digital age.
Wow. Just those concerns are being played out to the extreme in this fictional world.
To the extreme, yeah.
What about just anxiety in general?
Sure.
Is that something that's common in this society?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
The source points to something called generalized anxiety disorder as a widespread issue because there's this ever-present threat of sanctions for even the smallest infractions.
Oh, man. That sounds incredibly stressful.
It is.
I mean, I get anxious just thinking about it.
Yeah.
Being under that kind of scrutiny all the time.
Right. And the source actually connects the pressure to conform to these strict rules with this kind of chronic stress.
Oh, wow.
And in some ways, it reflects, I think, the pressures that we face in our own world to fit in.
Right.
Maybe not quite as extreme,
but
the parallels are definitely there.
Okay, so that's making me think about the whole nature of conformity.
Right.
Is that kind of the driving force behind some of these issues?
It definitely seems to be a major factor.
Okay.
For example, the table mentions obsessive-compulsive disorder, where people develop rituals and really strict adherence to rules as a way to cope.
So you're saying that in this world where the slightest deviation could have severe consequences, these rituals become a way to kind of feel safe?
Precisely. It's like clinging to routine becomes a survival mechanism.
Wow.
In this society where control is everything.
It's a lot to process. We've got paranoia, we've got anxiety, we've got obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it seems like they're all kind of tied to this need to conform.
To conform, yes.
And avoids punishment.
Exactly. And this is just scratching the surface of how the Rectitude impacts mental well-being.
Okay.
It gets even more complex when we start to look at the experiences of the Robotaries and hybrids themselves.
Okay, before we jump into that, can you just remind me who exactly the Robotaries and hybrids are?
Yeah. So the Robotaries are essentially these highly advanced androids, often with very human-like appearances. And they were created to serve various roles within this society.
Okay.
Now, the hybrids are a bit more complicated.
Right.
They're beings that combine both organic and synthetic components, so they really blur the lines between human and machine.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
So how do these groups experience these mental health issues differently?
Well, for them, it often becomes tied to their struggle for identity and the lasting impact of trauma. The source specifically points to a condition called schizophrenia, which is particularly prevalent among hybrids.
So schizophrenia, I know that that's a complex mental disorder in the real world as well.
Yes.
But how does it manifest in a being that's both human and machine?
Well, the source highlights the case of a Homo mechanicus hybrid as an example. And he seems to be experiencing a clash between his human consciousness and his AI consciousness, both vying for dominance within his mind.
Oh, that raises some serious questions.
It does.
About, what is the self?
Right.
What happens when two distinct consciousnesses are trapped in one being?
It really...
That's got to be a recipe for internal conflict.
It challenges our understanding of identity.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where technology is so deeply intertwined with existence.
This is already blowing my mind.
Yeah.
We're just getting started. What other disorders do the Robotaries and hybrids deal with?
Another fascinating one the source mentions is dissociative identity disorder. This seems to be especially prevalent in what they call nullified Robōtariis.
Hold on. Nullified. What does that mean?
Right. So nullified Robōtariis.
I don't want to get lost in the terminology here.
Yeah. It's basically a terrifying process where Robōtariis have their memories wiped and their personalities reprogrammed.
Oh, my God.
Often against their will.
That's messed up. So you're saying that this forced reprogramming...
It's like a digital lobotomy, right?
Can actually fracture someone's consciousness.
Yeah.
Causing them to develop multiple personalities.
That's what the source is suggesting, yeah.
Okay, this is getting dark.
Yeah.
We've got hybrids struggling with schizophrenia because of their dual nature.
Right.
And we've got nullified Robotaries dealing with fragmented identities because of this horrifying reprogramming.
Right.
What about trauma? Does that play a role?
Huge factor
In their psychological makeup?
Yeah. The source talks about a group called the Renegades. Which are often made up of former agents of the Rectitude or victims who've managed to break free of this nullification process. And many of them suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder.
So they're essentially refugees from this oppressive system.
In many ways, yes.
Wow.
And their experiences mirror the struggles that we see in real-world survivors of trauma, things like flashbacks, nightmares, difficulty connecting with others. You know, it makes you realize that the psychological scars of conflict and oppression are really universal, whether it's happening in this fictional world or our own.
Man, this deep dive is taking us to some pretty dark places.
It is, yeah.
But it's also incredibly fascinating. We've seen how, paranoia and anxiety and the need to conform can really mess with people's minds under the Rectitude. And now we're starting to see how the Robotaries and the hybrids are grappling with even more complex issues of identity and trauma.
Yeah, it's really interesting how those themes intersect.
What else does this table have in store for us?
Well, the source goes even deeper, touching on the existential questions that haunt some individuals in this world. It's about more than just surviving. It's about finding meaning in a reality that often denies them even basic freedoms.
Ooh, that sounds intense. I'm ready to dive into that existential rabbit hole.
All right, let's do it.
What kind of disorders are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, there's something called existential depression.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So this is described as this pervasive feeling of emptiness and lack of purpose.
Yeah.
It seems to be something that both Robotaries and hybrids experience, though for slightly different reasons,
That makes sense. I mean, their entire existence is so controlled.
Right.
I can see how that could lead to feeling lost.
Exactly.
Without a sense of purpose.
They're denied the freedom to define themselves, to make their own choices, to forge their own paths.
Right.
Imagine being sentient but denied any real autonomy. It's a pretty bleak reality.
It's like their very existence is a philosophical crisis.
It really is.
Are there any other conditions that touch on this existential struggle?
Definitely. The source brings up something called synthetic gender identity disorder.
Okay. I'm intrigued, but also a little lost.
Sure.
Break that down for me. What does that even mean for a Robotaria?
Well, you have to remember that Robotaries are programmed with specific roles and functions.
Okay.
But what happens when their internal sense of self doesn't align with those predetermined identities?
Oh, wow. That's deep. So even though they're essentially machines, they can experience a disconnect between their programmed gender.
It seems that way.
And their true sense of self.
Yeah, and it raises all these questions about the nature of identity, free will, whether it's even possible to program something as complex as self-awareness.
Yeah. This really makes you think.
It does.
It's like they're pushing back against their very programming.
Exactly.
Striving for individuality.
Yeah.
Within a system that seeks to control every aspect of their being.
And it's not so different from struggles we see in our own world, right?
Right.
Think about the expectations and social norms around gender that we all grapple with.
Right.
This fictional condition just highlights that very human desire to define oneself on your own terms.
That's a really powerful connection.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out to me from the table was this mention of solisalty.
Right.
And it just seemed so specific, yet so relevant to our own world.
It is. Solastalgia is basically the distress caused by environmental destruction.
Okay.
And the source links this to the widespread anxieties about the state of their planet.
Right.
Because the aggressive industrialization under the Rectitude has taken a heavy toll on the environment.
It's like they're experiencing ecological grief.
Yeah.
Which is a feeling that I think resonates with
very much so, a
lot of people today.
Yeah.
With the growing threat of climate change and everything.
Absolutely.
It makes you wonder, like, what are the long-term psychological consequences of watching our own planet change?
That's a question worth pondering for sure. We've talked a lot about how these pathologies relate to our own world.
Right.
But there are some conditions that are unique to the Robotaries, that really blur the lines between human and machine in ways that we can only imagine.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about those.
Yeah.
What else does this table reveal?
One that really jumped out at me is called alexithymia, and it describes this programmed inability to feel emotions.
Wait, so they're basically emotionless?
Essentially, yes.
That's like the opposite of everything we've been talking about.
It is. It really is.
With the existential angst and the identity struggles and all of that.
Yeah. And it makes you question, the very nature of sentience and consciousness.
Right.
Can a being truly be considered self-aware?
Right.
Without the capacity to feel?
Yeah.
Is a life without emotion even a life worth living?
Those are huge questions, especially with the advancement of AI in our world.
Absolutely.
It's like, science fiction is becoming reality.
It is. And speaking of technology, there's another Robōtariis condition called technology-induced psychosis.
I think I can guess where this is going.
Yeah, it's all about how immersive technology warps an individual's perception of reality.
We talked about, the potential for addiction and losing touch with the real world, but this sounds way more serious.
It's a more extreme manifestation.
Right.
In the Robōtariis world, the source suggests that this constant bombardment of information, propaganda, and sensory manipulation by the Rectitude actually pushes people to the point of psychotic breaks.
So it's not just about, like, being addicted to virtual reality.
Yeah.
It's about technology being weaponized.
Exactly.
To control your very thoughts.
Yeah. Like a high-tech form of brainwashing.
Right.
And the really unsettling part is that the source implies that this type of psychosis is becoming more common as technology advances.
Man. It makes you wonder if we're headed down a similar path.
It's a cautionary tale for sure.
It's a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
All this tech that we rely on could it be used against us?
It's a question we have to ask ourselves.
I'm suddenly feeling a lot less excited about the metaverse.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. But there are still more fascinating, albeit disturbing, pathologies to explore in this table.
Okay, hit me with them. I'm ready for more.
Well, one that stands out is dissociation psychologique.
Okay.
It's described as a feeling of disconnect from one's body and environment, often linked to past trauma.
That sounds incredibly unsettling. I can't imagine feeling so detached from reality.
The source suggests it's particularly common among hybrids.
Okay.
Imagine struggling to reconcile your organic and robotic parts.
Yeah.
Feeling like a stranger in your own body.
That's like a constant identity crisis.
Right.
Amplified by the very fusion of flesh and technology.
Legs.
Yeah.
What else?
Something called épuisement professionnel.
Okay.
Which is essentially burnout.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That overwhelming exhaustion from constant pressure and demands. Tell me the Robōtariis aren't dealing with that too.
They are. The source highlights how the relentless production demands of the Rectitude
lead to widespread burnout among citizens.
It's like the sister itself is designed to grind people down.
It is.
Leaving them depleted and demoralized.
Precisely. And it's not just the physical demands.
Right.
It's the psychological toll.
Right.
Constant surveillance, fear of sanctions.
Yeah.
It all contributes to this pervasive sense of burnout.
It seems like there's no escape from this pressure cooker.
It's a tough reality.
This deep dive is really painting a bleak picture of life under the rectitude.
It is. And it continues with a condition called hypervigilance.
Hypervigilance. What does that look like in this context?
Imagine being in a constant state of alert, always anticipating a threat.
Right.
The source explains that this is, driven by the ever-present surveillance, the fear of being denounced or captured.
So it's a survival mechanism in a world where you can't trust anyone.
Exactly. Both those who live under the rectitude and the renegades who have escaped are in a perpetual state of anxiety.
It makes me think about, those living under authoritarian regimes in our world.
Right.
The psychological toll of constant fear must be immense.
It is, and sadly, it extends to relationships as well.
Okay.
The table mentions trouble de l'attachement, which essentially describes difficulty forming and maintaining meaningful bonds.
That's heartbreaking.
It is.
Connection to such a fundamental human need.
It is, and yet the source explains how this is a common problem for Robōtariis and hybrids.
Okay.
They are often isolated or treated as tools, deprived of genuine human connections.
It really highlights the dehumanizing nature of the rectitude.
It does.
It prioritizes control and conformity over compassion and basic human needs.
Exactly.
What a messed up system.
And speaking of the system, there's a concept called narcissism institutionnel that applies directly to the rectitude.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one. Break it down for me.
Essentially, it's a system that exaggerates its own importance and seeks to crush anything that threatens its power.
Wow.
Think propaganda, cult-like adherence, and a complete intolerance for dissent.
So you're saying the system itself has a personality disorder?
That's a great way to put it.
Wow.
This institutional narcissism is so pervasive that it makes it almost impossible for individuals to challenge it. Or even recognize the extent of the control they're under.
Oh, it's like living in a giant echo chamber.
Exactly. And this control extends to manipulating people's very emotions. The source describes anesthésie émotionnelle, which is essentially a loss of the ability to feel.
Wow.
Particularly prevalent among nullified Robōtariis.
That's just cruel.
It is.
They're robbed of their very humanity, their capacity to experience joy or pain.
And, this emotional numbness serves the purposes of the rectitude perfectly. It creates a workforce that's docile, compliant, and incapable of resisting.
It's chilling. This deep dive just keeps getting darker and darker.
It does. And it brings up the question of whether anyone can break free. The source talks about dépendance au système, which describes this psychological inability to function outside the imposed system.
So even if they had the opportunity to escape, they'd be too conditioned to even imagine a life outside the rectitude.
That's what the source suggests.
Wow.
They become so reliant on its structure that they've lost the capacity for self-reliance.
It's like being trapped in a gilded cage.
Exactly.
Even with the door wide open.
And it's further complicated by another condition, syndrome du survivant, which is survivor's guilt.
So this is affecting those who have escaped the renegades.
They often struggle with intense guilt over the fact that they survived while others perished.
It's a heavy burden to carry, and one we see in the real world, too.
Absolutely.
Especially among survivors of war or disaster.
Yeah. It highlights the complex psychological impact of trauma. And the struggle to come to terms with events that defy all sense of logic or justice.
I'm exhausted just thinking about all these psychological challenges. This deep dive has really taken us on a roller coaster ride through the dark side of the Robōtariis world. We've covered so much ground, but I feel like there's still more to unpack.
You're right. There's one final condition that ties everything together and sheds a new light on the psychological landscape of this world.
I'm ready to hear it. What is it?
It's called.
You mentioned one final condition that ties everything together. Lay it on me.
It's called psychose induite par la technologie, which basically translates to technology-induced psychosis.
Wow, that sounds like a heavy one.
Yeah, it is. It describes how constant exposure to immersive technology, specifically the kind used by the rectitude for control and manipulation, can actually lead to a complete break from reality.
Yeah, we've talked about the potential for addiction and even the idea of technology being used for, brainwashing.
Right.
But this sounds even more intense.
It's the extreme end of the spectrum. Think about it. Constant bombardment of information, propaganda, sensory manipulation.
Right.
It's no wonder that some individuals, both citizens and Robotaries, experience like full-blown psychotic episodes.
So this isn't just someone spending too much time in the metaverse.
No.
This is about the technology itself being used as a tool of psychological warfare.
Exactly. And the source implies that as technology advances in the Robotariis world, this kind of psychosis is becoming more and more prevalent.
Oh, wow.
So it makes you wonder, what are the limits of technological control? Right. Are we headed down a similar path in our own world? You know, this entire deep dive has been kind of a wake-up call. Yeah. We've talked about how the Rectitude creates this climate of fear and control, leading to paranoia, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Yeah. And then we see how that impacts the Robotariis and hybrids, causing these identity crises, trauma, and this profound sense of existential emptiness. Yeah. And now we're seeing how technology is being used to push people over the edge, you know, causing full-on psychotic breaks.
Yeah, it's a bleak picture, but I guess it's a reality we need to confront.
It is.
I mean, the Robotariis world might be fictional. Right. But the questions it raises are all too real.
They are. What I find really fascinating, though, is that even in this incredibly oppressive and technologically controlled world, there's still this spark of resistance.
Yes.
You know, the fact that these characters are struggling with these issues, questioning their reality, searching for meaning, it means that the human spirit, or in this case, their Robotarii spirit, hasn't been completely extinguished.
That's such an important point.
Yeah.
The very act of experiencing these pathologies, of grappling with these difficult questions, it suggests a refusal to be completely subdued.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a glimmer of hope in their struggle. And maybe that's the takeaway here for our listeners. Even in the darkest of times, even when it feels like the system is designed to crush you, the human spirit can endure.
I love that. It's a reminder that resilience, that fight for autonomy and self-definition is a powerful force.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. A bit unsettling at times.
It has.
But definitely eye-opening.
For sure.
So we've delved into the psychological landscape of the Robotariis today.
We did.
Exploring this complex interplay of technology, societal pressures, and the enduring human spirit.
Absolutely.
Hopefully this deep dive has sparked some thought-provoking questions for you, our listeners.
I hope so.
You know, maybe it's made you think about how technology is shaping your own life, or maybe it's ignited a curiosity about the potential for both good and evil that exists within our ever-evolving relationship with the digital world.
Yeah.
Whatever your takeaway, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, and to never stop seeking knowledge.
The mind is a powerful thing.
It is.
Capable of incredible resilience and adaptation.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, stay curious.